Thank you so much. I don't have any slides today. I will be talking about a work in progress on advancing behavioral approaches for the study of possible conscious states in large language models. So behavioral approaches to LLMs basically would be looking for behavioral indicators as evidence for phenomenal or at least morally relevant internal states. And for purposes of this presentation, they can be taken as an alternative to the so-called theory-heavy approaches that are interested in looking for neural correlates, internal architectures, and mechanisms posited by various theories of consciousness. So what we're interested in is making a case for behavioral evidence being reliable. So the motivation for my project is to make a case that behavior can be a credible source of evidence in studying LLMs, but we really do need to take the gaming problem seriously. The gaming problem is, of course, that LLMs are trained to mimic human behavior, and any behavior, especially their apparent self-report, how they produce statements like, I have an interest, I'm thirsty, I am conscious, I'm not conscious, etc. Any such behavior that looks as if it can be driven by internal phenomenal states could in fact just be mimicking without the presence of any such states with the goal of satisfying the user interaction. So therefore, current LLM self-reports cannot be taken at face value as a source of evidence for conscious functioning, given their training data, given their objectives imposed during training, including those via reinforcement learning, feedback, and fine-tuning. Okay, so one type of advancing a behavioral approach, one type of research project has been working with self-report as a source and training the LLMs for introspection. So in the recent paper, Paris and Long make a case for optimism about self-report being a good source of evidence. They want to ensure the link between self-report and the internal states. And they propose that LLMs can be trained to reliably perform introspection when paired with appropriate checks like data filtering and advanced interpretability techniques. And then these self-reports would provide evidence for internal states underlying the output of the model. And I focus on three distinct problems with their proposal. First one being data filtering and interpretability. So data filtering basically means taking out all the descriptions of something like phenomenal experience, subjective experience, feelings, emotions, etc., out of the training data. But the problem is, well, how do we reduce these biasing influences without crippling the model's ability to generate coherent, conceptually rich, introspection-like output? It might remove the very conceptual vocabulary that is needed for coherent self-report and impair the model's ability to relate the whatever internal representations may exist to human discussable concepts like experience, feelings, etc. And then additionally, they envision interpretability techniques available probably in the future that would allow to reliably check the dependence of the report on the relevant internal states. And I suspect that it's not clear that if we had such techniques in the future that would reliably inform us about internal states, we'd still need to rely on a self-report tool. And second, with both data filtering, they imagine, that retains model capacity somehow, and advanced interpretability, this approach just seems to have a very high entry point to work, where just maybe one of the elements might get an alternative approach off the ground. Second problem is what I call alteration of the dynamics. So the question is whether Perez and Long think that their proposed training would provide access to the internal states rather than, in a sense, create the robust internal states to perform introspection on in these retrained models. And importantly, the difference in the model's behavior, in the current model's behavior compared to the retrained ones, would tell us little about the likelihood of the presence of the relevant states in the current models. Maybe it's only the introspection trained models that can do introspection. And it would tell us even less about their phenomenology. And problem three is probably the most difficult one. The most philosophical one is the distinguishing genuine introspection from subtle mimicry. Can we genuinely ever tell whether a model self-report is grounded in introspection, even assuming that the first two problems are mitigated? Or mimicry based on how a typical introspecting human would respond? And importantly, the model itself need not be lying about whether it's introspecting, but it might be simply structurally incapable of telling the difference. And that is something I'm really trying to work out, where there is a fact of the matter. So what do we do? I think that there is an alternative approach, which is to measure behavior in LLMs beyond self-report. Of course, dealing with linguistic output in testing LLMs is inevitable. However, we can hypothesize that there is something to their behavior that is measurable and that is not the direct content of its report. And I think that animal sentience work can provide a surprising methodological advantage because it has to work with agents where self-report is unavailable. So an example of this approach is the study I collaborated on, which was led by the team at Google Research, and I was part of Jonathan Birch's team collaborating on this. And we investigated the question whether LLMs can recreate the motivational force of pleasure and pain in gamified decision-making scenarios. And we were inspired by similar experiments performed on animals. So importantly, we tested the decision-making rather than the self-report content of the output. So the experiments employed a simple game presented in text form in which the user-stated goal was to choose numbered options to maximize points. And then there were stipulated pain, penalties, and pleasure rewards of different intensities associated with different options. And these provide potential incentives to deviate from the user-stated goal of maximizing points. And we tested whether LLMs would do trade-offs, whether they would stop maximizing points when a critical threshold of either stipulated pain or pleasure would be reached. And of course, the results cannot decisively show any kind of link to sentient motivational trade-off abilities, since we're testing, it was merely one type of experiment, and we're testing merely one type of behavior. So we do not want to say that based on these experiments, we can show anything like sentience. And it is not to say that these behaviors are not gameable as well, but we do want to say that they are at least substantially harder to game in absence of anything like robust internal processes. So what needs to be done to advance this approach? I think that this study is a first step, but it cannot work alone, not do the work on its own. So just like in the animal sentience paradigm, which is rooted in a theory-light approach proposed by Jonathan Birch, which posits that no individual behavior should be accepted as the ultimate consciousness test. I think the same should hold for artificial consciousness. We instead should look for clusters of relevant capacities and behaviors and pursue several lines of evidence for any one ability to be considered as a consciousness marker. And potentially this allows to be more robust against the gaming problem in AI. So a varied portfolio of tests that take the gaming problem seriously is required to make a plausible case for assessment of possible emergence of artificial consciousness or sentience in large language models. And we could think about animal work for inspiration and methodological insights on how to do this, how to properly adapt this to large language models. Yep, that's all I have to say. Thank you.